This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond, plus interviews with European policymakers and analysts. I'm William Glucroft, a journalist who writes the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
I am Martin Gack in Berlin. I write Inconclusive Thoughts.
We are recording Monday, March 18th, so events may have changed by the time you hear this podcast, wherever your ears go for podcasts. But today we'll be talking about, yes, that Egypt deal, more on the Israel Association deal, the Weimar Summit, a €5 billion accounting trick, Barack Obama was in Belgium, and of course, Vladimir Putin is, surprise, surprise, president again. All right, Martin, it's another Monday, another week, but it doesn't seem, I think as we often feel, the week doesn't really end, because especially this weekend, because there was lots of news going on this weekend.
Yes, it was actually, full cycle, really. Gaza just continues to deteriorate. The Israeli position also seems to continue to deteriorate, and there was a lot of stuff happening around Europe. Iceland is once again on fire. You probably saw that. Another volcanic eruption and more displacement and so on. The news around the world were really quite unsettling. So yeah, I mean, I did spend quite a bit of the weekend once again looking at my computer screen. Never really fun.
Yeah, I was very disciplined and actually tried to tune out a little bit this weekend, even though I knew big things were happening. But as you've pointed out, it just gets a bit much. I often say that, journalists, we doom scroll so you don't have to, but even we need to stop doom scrolling every once in a while. So I'm down in beautiful Bavaria and spent the weekend in Munich catching some opera, although even in that case, I couldn't quite escape current events, since the opera we saw was The Passenger, which is a futile German attempt to cope with its past. And I'll leave it at that, since I'm not a culture and certainly not an opera critic. But yeah, even when you try to see some art and culture, you still are sort of slammed with a lot of contemporary issues, that are going on. But it's certainly nice to get out of the Hauptstadt and come on down to the Texas of Germany, as I like to call it, Bavaria. That's
a strange analogy, I must say.
Bavaria used to be its own state, its own sort of sovereign entity, as Texas used to be. They're very independent-minded. They're very conservative, much like the Texans. They love their meat, although not barbecue necessarily. There's a lot of strange parallels. What Bavaria is to Germany, I find Texas to be like to the United States. So,
yeah. Well, anyhow, so what are the big stories of the week?
I mean, a lot of the stories we have are sort of continuations from last week. One of them being the sort of the money to Egypt. There's the money to Egypt for nominally migration, although they don't dare speak the M word too loudly. 7.4 billion euros going to Egypt in an aid package. As we discussed last week, your European officials have smartened up about how they frame it and package it. I think we talked with EU Observer's managing editor Elena Sanchez-Nicolas about this, that it's not so much about migration anymore. It's more about the EU supporting and helping its countries on the periphery in terms of economic development, developing certain industrial sectors. But of course, underneath all of that is this sort of wink and a nod towards keeping migrants at bay. I think what I've read is of the 7.4 billion euros, only a couple hundred million of that is officially earmarked for migration-related policy issues. The rest is to go, as I said, economic stuff, industrial policy, socioeconomic aspects. But what's interesting to me is that there seems to be very few strings attached, and the transparency mechanism on this is very questionable. The European Commission has been pretty flat out that this is money for Egypt to spend as it sees fit. And a government like Egypt, and its rather illiberal and corrupt history, it's kind of a strange deal to just hand over 7.4 billion euros in European Union taxpayer money and just say, whatever you think is best for your country, go ahead, have fun.
I think, this follows pattern. I mean, with a lot of the von der Leyen Commission, a lot of the sort of very unsettling moves that the Commission does very often, seen as being directly opposed to both European values and when not to European law. So I think that, this follows pattern with a whole bunch of things, including sort of the money dispensed to Hungary. And there seems to be a lot of questions about the discretion that the Commission sort of uses, and some would say abuses, in order to dispense money for political favors, I suppose, or for political expediency, very often against sort of the better angels of what the European project is supposed to be. The outsourcing of many of the things and money given to northern African countries to deal with migration are really quite remarkable in this matter, because they quite literally are essentially funding governments which have very, very dubious practices almost in every department that Europe claims to guard and claims to uphold.
Right. I mean, so you mentioned transparency and discretion. I mean, that also ties into the other story we talked about last week, which is this lawsuit that the European Parliament wants to file. And actually, sort of the latest iteration in this long process is that they did confirm the entire Parliament sort of took the advice of the Legal Affairs Committee, and they will move ahead with suing the European Commission over the 10 billion euros it unblocked at the end of last year for Hungary.
Indeed. I mean, that is actually bound to be a very interesting story as the year progresses, because it would have all sorts of repercussions. It also would pose very serious questions as to what happens if in June the European Parliament becomes more aligned with the Orban political position by, the ECR and the ID becoming more powerful operators within the Parliament, whether these kind of things would actually change. In any case, on the international front, Josep Borrell, the de facto foreign minister of the European Union, or as they like to call him, the top diplomat, has basically said that a suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which basically comes down to the European Union treating Israel as a favored commercial partner, the suspension of this agreement is on the table. And he did not say much, but he did say that he would open the discussion with foreign ministers from across the bloc. This is interesting because it comes at a time in which there is a lot of pressure that international partners of Israel and countries that had been marching pretty much in lockstep, one would say, with Israel, even in the face of some of the ugliest developments of the last 5 months, including the carpet bombing of a civilian population and whatnot, the sort of strangling of Gaza, even Borrell himself claims is the use of famine as a weapon of war against the Gaza civilian population. Even then, most of these countries, the US included, and the European Union itself as an institution, could not really bring themselves to actually criticize or to demand that Israel put a stop to this way of conducting, its war in Gaza. So I think that what we're seeing is basically more salvos being shot, more warning shots being sort of put out. This is included, I think, among them. Also, we saw Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, visiting this weekend Jerusalem, sitting down with Netanyahu, and once again warning him, as some German media probably wanted to say, boasting more than they really should, but warning him against an operation in Rafah, in the south of the Gaza Strip, without proper measures to protect the civilian population. It seems really quite clear that Netanyahu has told anybody that will listen, including Washington, including Berlin, including Paris, including Brussels, that he just does not care, that he will go into Rafah, that he will continue with business as usual, and that, humanitarian questions of essentially the loss of war and, the protections of the civilian population to the wind, really, which sort of shows a path forward that can only seem to be resolved by either a diplomatic or a political confrontation. As to what exact shape that would take, I think it's very difficult to say, but I think it's also very clear that Jerusalem and Western capitals are on a confrontation course. I think a lot of this, and this is the last thing I will say about this, at least for now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that left-wing or center-left parties, Borrell belongs to the socialists in Spain, Biden belongs to whatever the Democrats are in the US, Scholz is at least nominally a socialist in Germany, and so on and so forth. These parties are seeing that the Gaza conflict is really denting their electoral base, who is in many cases sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, or actually Arabs and Muslims who are very close to the Palestinian crisis and the Palestinian situation. So, we're finally seeing, I think, center-left politics trying to react in order not so much to guarantee themselves that these people will not vote for conservatives, which very likely will not, but that they will not stay home come election day. And just a reminder, should anybody need it, in June, we're going to have elections in Europe, and in November in the US.
Yeah, I think the confrontation course you mentioned, this association deal, I'm very curious how it's going to develop. Something called an association agreement sounds rather wishy-washy, but if you think about what that actually is, it was an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union in 2014 that kicked off the Maidan protests, or I should say the undoing of this association agreement that kicked off the Maidan protests, and then ultimately Putin's first quasi-invasion, the Little Green Men invasion to take Crimea. And that was over an association agreement to bring Ukraine closer and more into the European fold. So I'm curious to what extent, what parallel impact that could have if there is changes or suspension of an association agreement between Israel and the European Union. It could actually have some real diplomatic and political teeth, as you said, setting up for some kind of confrontation with real consequences.
Indeed, I think that what is very interesting about this little sort of strange contraptions like commercial agreements or energy agreements, or, they don't have sort of the gravitas, they don't sound quite as large as mutual defense agreements. But they seem to be the type of connecting tissue that ultimately really does have a large impact on geostrategic alignments. I think it's very, very clear that there is a lot of displeasure with the way that Jerusalem is conducting the war. I think that finally Europe is beginning to see it, not just demonstrators protesting on their streets, but it's beginning to see it pouring into its political system. And I think that they all realize, every single one of them, that it's probably 20 minutes too late to really stop Netanyahu in any way, shape, or form. I have to say that it's absolutely mind-boggling to see Scholz, who essentially comes from the center-left, but essentially, a European left, sitting down and talking about his friend Netanyahu, who is essentially a far-right, a far-right cadre that would fit very much in line with Orban. I wouldn't say probably Hocker in the AfD, but close enough, right? And this has been pointed out by people that are following the story. In any case, this is still something that is developing, and I think that it will have a lot of legs. What's next?
Yeah, what is next? There's so much, right? A couple new developments on Ukraine that sort of dovetail together. They're separate issues, but they dovetail together. You had on one hand the €5 billion, the agreement on another €5 billion for the European Peace Facility, which is always a funny term, a bit of a doublespeak, because this peace facility is for buying weapons for Ukraine and other military equipment to fight its war, to defend itself against Russia. I feel like they should rename it a little bit, like I don't know, European Defense Fund or something, but calling it a peace facility when at least in the short term or the immediate term, it's about waging war. I always find that very interesting. But anyway, the real criticism of it is that it's just an accounting trick, that it's not really new or more money for Ukraine and for supporting Ukraine. It's really just a way for European member states to rejig their books to make it look like they're putting more money in. And one of the biggest ways was in a pushback against more money by Germany, especially, and some other countries. This idea that they could offset their bilateral aid to Ukraine, take that money and subtract it what they're obligated to pay into this EU fund. So ultimately, you're kind of splitting the difference. You're not really adding to it. That's been the big difference. That most people are saying that this is just a repackaging of funds. It's not really any new funds. Nonetheless, it does come after weeks of disagreement on what to do next with this peace facility, which has been a fund that the EU has dipped into multiple times as a means of buying weapons and sending equipment to Ukraine. So there is this, at least it survives another day. It still exists as a fund, as a source of money for equipment. But if it's really anything new or anything that's going to give Ukraine a tactical edge or a leg up in its what's becoming a more desperate campaign against Russia, that's very much an open question. Or maybe the question's been answered, but it actually won't. And that, of course, comes on top of all these disagreements about what's next with Ukraine and what kind of support the West can give it, and what seems like a lot of flagging support, especially from the Germans and the French. And the Germans and the French love sniping at each other and scoring political points and points in the press by saying clever things about each other and who's sort of the better European on a number of issues. But to try to smooth things over, there was that so-called Weimar summit between the Poles, the Germans and the French, to sort of show a united front that despite the disagreements, all three countries are united against Russia and supporting Ukraine. But again, nothing super tangible that came out of the summit, more just a reaffirmation that they stand by Ukraine.
I think that we're going to see this thing sort of continue to roll on as, the discussion of the reconstruction of Ukraine, or whatever is left of Ukraine after the European version of victory, reigns on Ukrainian territory, which seems to be shrinking, as we have discussed several times, week after week after week. I think that this conversation will just continue in, whatever way it can continue. It's really a way in which it seems to me Europeans are always finding a handy approach to expressing support for Ukraine without really having to do too much work, as you I guess pointed out yourself, right? I mean, we don't need a lot of money. We can just cook the books in some sense. We don't really need a lot of ammo. We can just make promises. Things don't get delivered, but hey. In any case, so Obama, the American president that most Europeans would like to have, just visited Belgium and participated in a technology conference. And, as it's been pointing out, he did talk a bit about artificial intelligence and some suches, but he did spend quite a bit of time talking about policy. And of course, as every Democrat that visits its shores, he tried to reassure people that, Trump would be a catastrophe, but that he would not necessarily win, that there is still hope. But he also pointed out that the divergences between European agendas and American agendas remain relevant. He explained that they can be worked out. But I think that this emphasis on the divergence of these two political positions and geopolitical positions, particularly, goes once again to emphasize that people that are very close to the Washington power machine, particularly on the Democratic side, do not themselves seem convinced that the U.S. will be standing there to help Europe if the water starts going up. So they don't say it in so many words, but they keep coming here and talking about something that used to be the purview of the Russians, to a Russian ambassador to NATO, to say that, strategic sovereignty and defense independence were great things for Europe. Now we seem to begin to have all these rumors coming from Americans emphasizing the possibility of something that they didn't seem to like very much, which was Europe breaking away from the NATO umbrella and looking for sort of a self-assertive defense project. It seems that slowly but surely, even figures like Obama are actually making noises in that direction. And I find it actually quite unsettling, I must say.
The big threat that Trump poses is not necessarily his policies and positions, because he doesn't really have any. It's how unpredictable he is. He might wake up one day and think NATO was great, and then the next day he'll think NATO was terrible, because Donald Trump's number one priority is Donald Trump. So that's the big threat. It's not whether he is for or against Europe and European security. So we just can't quite predict what's going to come out of his mouth, and what comes out of his mouth is real, and what comes out of his mouth is just some crazy idea he had, and what might become policy and what might not be. The misgivings about NATO and European defense spending predate Donald Trump. It really goes to show how important rhetoric is and how important framing is. Barack Obama says it in a friendly way. He says it in a very soothing way. He says it in a diplomatic way, in a way that wants to encourage Europe and its allies. But ultimately, Barack Obama is just as skeptical. He said it in this talk in Antwerp about European defense commitments to their own security, let alone to the NATO alliance as a whole and power projection into Indo-Pacific, etc. And we have to always remember that this magic 2% goal of GDP for defense spending came in Obama's time in 2014. It's not a Trump idea. And that successive U.S. presidents have criticized Europe for its lackluster defense spending. And I think that's really important as we go into elections, that yes, Barack Obama has a case that Donald Trump is not going to be great for Europe, most likely, but also there's an incredible amount of protectionism and isolationism in all political stripes in the United States right now. And under Biden, Biden has maintained Trump's tariff war, trade war with China. There was still the blow up over aluminum and steel with Europe. There was threatening all kinds of tariffs between the EU and the US, most of which have been smoothed over. There's, of course, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that has been hugely crippling or hurt or harmful to the European economy to benefit the US. So it's not just Donald Trump, as you've pointed out. The US is entering a period of protectionism and isolationism, essentially becoming the victim of its own success. Its global, its set of liberal world values has succeeded tremendously, and more countries are rich, and that's making more countries powerful, which of course threatens U.S. power around the world. And now the U.S. kind of wants to step back and make sure its own power and interests are protected. So that's very important. I think that's always an important note. And I think Obama's presence at this Antwerp event is a good reminder of that.
I think that, so what I really do want to underscore about your point, and I have a question to actually ask you, is the fact that although from a European perspective, and this is particularly true when you talk to people in the Brussels bubble and when you talk to German politicians who still have this sort of Americanophilia, we were saved by the Americans and we will never depart from... there is a tendency to completely misjudge how aligned both parties in the political machine in Europe is. How aligned the political machine in the US is. How much actually Democrats and Republicans see Europe in through a very, very similar lens. Meaning it's a frenemy kind of thing, but very often more an enemy than a friend. I mean, sure, they like to have baguettes in Paris and, espresso in Rome, but they still think of the French as pretty snotty, and they still think of the Italians as pretty disorderly. And this is something that, reflects in the way that, as you were pointing out, the Democrats, perhaps with a softer touch, with the good cop approach, still take sort of very often a very antagonistic position towards European policy. Of course, I mean, I think it is understood that, well, if Russia is the liability, Berlin is a quicker line of defense than Alexandria or than Cape Cod. But I think that, notwithstanding that, the positions when you talk about trade, when you talk about the way in which, the U.S. looks at Europe sort of projecting its relation with like the Middle East or like with China or with Russia. I mean, it's clear that you could see this very clearly, I think, in the unanimity with which the American Congress essentially looked at Nord Stream 2, right? Nord Stream 2, which was essentially a German project for, the movement of Russian energy, which would have bypassed Poland and so on and so forth. At that point, Poland really not being exactly the democratic beacon in Europe. This was opposed like across the aisle. Both parties in the US had a pretty well sort of choreographed opposition to the project. So I think that it does paint a sobering picture. And I think that in some sense does not make Trump as egregious for Europe as what it might look at first sight. What I wanted to ask is actually, how do you see this division essentially playing out in relation to the Gaza conflict? How do you think that, the American and the European position aligns? We know that the US had to pick up the phone, Washington had to pick up the phone and kind of corral and push Spain and sort of, had a couple of tough talks with different European capitals to try to push them away from condemning Israel and so on and so forth. How do you see this?
Well, as is often said, Israel is one of the few strong, consistent bilateral positions. Republicans and Democrats kind of try to out-pro-Israel each other to show how loyal they are. And you have strong Jewish voter bases for both parties. I mean, more for Democrats. The Jewish Americans tend to be more liberal and vote for Democrats, but you also have, due to pre-Trump Republican foreign policy positions, you would have strong Republican support on foreign policy issues when it came to Israel. And what Trump does, he kind of throws a spanner in these works because, again, as I said, he's so unpredictable. On one hand, he is the man behind the Muslim ban. He has no love lost for Muslims or immigrants or brown people, to be very broad about it. But he could wake up one day and say, to hell with Israel. Why should I care about this tiny country in the Middle East? And he might totally just give up on a partnership like Israel, just as he threatens to give up on a partnership with the European Union. So I just find it very unpredictable.
You might remember that there was a very strange moment about 2 months ago, or 3 months ago perhaps, where Trump actually dissed, as the kids are saying these days, Netanyahu, accused him of lack of gratitude. And it sort of created a very strange moment of tension. He has said in several occasions things that would normally be taken to be quite disparaging of Jews, even as he was president. But this one was particularly strange because it was not so much a question of, race or religion, it had to do more with like a fracture in the political family of the global far right. I wonder if that will progress into further conflict, especially if, these things begin to sort of pour into American streets.
Yeah. Honestly, sort of this is a bit too broad of a brush, but I think a Trump presidency would be very bad for the United States domestically, but might not be so bad for the world in terms of foreign policy, because the one thing that the world often complains about is we don't want America to be the global policeman. We don't want them having this global military hegemony. And we saw in Trump's first term, he, by American presidential standards, was very uninvolved in the world and used military power very little. He's actually, in this weird way, not that imperial of a president, even though at the same time his rhetoric is awful, and he'll say awful things about anybody. As you just said, he'll say he'll say Islamophobic things, he'll say anti-Semitic things. He's just has it out for everyone because he, as I said, he's really only out for himself. So very hard to predict.
What is very interesting about the Trump presidency geopolitically is that although it is true that sort of the level of military confrontation during his tenure was reduced, the aftermath of this sort of dereliction of geopolitical power by the US and the kind of power vacuums that it left across the board, almost everywhere you look, bloomed into incredibly bloody conflicts of the likes we have not seen in a very long time. I mean, arguably, the current bombing of Gaza, the war in 2022 began in 2022, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A lot of what we're seeing in Africa, particularly French Africa, are sort of fairly direct, results of a certain, I would argue, dereliction of power. I mean, the U.S. under Trump essentially shouted to the wind that they were abandoning Ukraine, that Ukraine was essentially a source of corruption for his sworn enemy, which is the Democratic Party, obviously, and the Bidens. That the people that were actually in power in Ukraine were painted with a brush quite similar to the one that Putin would use. And arguably, I mean, this encouraged the Russians, thinking that, okay, well, maybe we'll only need to deal with Biden for 4 years. And it's unclear whether, the Americans would actually be able to step quick enough onto the plate. I think that one could say almost the same for Israel. I mean, Trump went there, moved the embassy, gave, unequivocal support to Israel to do whatever they wanted at a time in which, seizures in the West Bank and so on, all sorts of very dubious things were happening across the board. And as a matter of fact, I mean, he cemented to a large degree through his son-in-law the relation with Saudi Arabia. So opening essentially Israel to a can do no harm kind of policy. So that the sort of do whatever the hell you want, we're out of here. I think it's actually one of the sources of all of the mechanisms that actually were activated later, not just itself the 7th of October attack and what came afterwards, but the fact that the Israelis were so willing to sort of put massive pressure on the Palestinian population, sort of go into Al-Aqsa Mosque, really sort of flex muscle in the middle of Palestinian areas, seize all sorts of properties, evict people. Still, I mean, these things were happening as Americans were essentially looking completely the other way. So I think that to me, what is interesting is that it might not be so bad in terms of intervention, but I am not of the opinion that when you actually vacate a political space, that political space is essentially left empty. I think that what you have is that new forces that come in, and very often they're very unruly, and in this current cases, they can be extremely dangerous.
Be careful what you wish for, right?
Exactly. So I have no great love for American foreign policy, coming from Argentina myself, having seen, the back end of that. But I will say that there is a type of Pax Americana that is built on the sheer presence of these forces and these operators in the area. I mean, I think arguably one of the most, dramatic and catastrophic moves, geopolitical moves of the Vatican, which has actually a very strong geopolitical muscle, was convincing Obama to actually abandon Syria, convincing the Americans not to march into Syria. I mean, it would have been a disaster. Iraq was a disaster. 1 million people were killed by the American machine and its aftermath. But what you ended up having in Syria, the moment that Americans retreat, is another kind of brutality unfolding. Russians with the Al-Assad government just basically, going completely medieval postal, as Americans like to say, on entire swaths of the country. I mean, making Aleppo, much in the way that they have done Grozny, making Aleppo into sort of a massive ghost town. So I think that...
Not unlike Gaza.
Well, not unlike Gaza, right? So, I mean, I think that this pattern of sort of geopolitical and geostrategic behavior in which the U.S. retreats allows space for very virulent, autocratic, really in most cases, machineries to exercise power on a civilian population in very brutal ways, is something that I think that we would see multiplied in a second Trump White House. And that's, I must say, gives me a lot of pause.
Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox of the criticism of a very justified criticism of American foreign policy and American hegemony. For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. You upset status quo, and the global order, for better and for many times for worse, is built on the assumption that the U.S. will be there everywhere in all places and have its say and put its thumb on the scale. If that's suddenly not there, it's not just going to be rainbows and gumdrops. There's going to be a reaction to that. And I think that's a very salient point you've made.
Yeah. So
shall we move on?
November is around the corner.
Yeah.
So Putin won the Russian election with 87% of votes.
It was a real nail biter there, Really didn't know who was going to win.
Yeah, for a full second I was not quite sure which way this was going to go.
Do you think Vladimir Putin, there's like some deep down part of him that's kind of disappointed by all the anti-climax of it? When you're going to win, there's no suspense. Do you think any part of him just kind of wishes there was a little bit of competition?
Given the fact that the only Russian game that I have ever heard of is the roulette, I would assume that most Russians, Putin included, prefer to know what the end will be of whatever game is being played. This was not to be an exciting challenge for Putin or any of his political machine. I don't really think that there is anything to be made of this other than the fact that, a fifth term of Putin clearly looks like the assertion of, imperial power and monarchic rule. I mean, I think that we are now sort of deep within the model. The form has been established. And increasingly, there seems to be less of an appetite from the Kremlin to actually disguise itself as a liberal democracy, or a democracy at all. As a matter of fact, this is one of the first things that Putin did after winning the elections or whatever, winning this fishbowl fishing competition.
I think it's diving for apples. I think he won a diving for apples competition.
Diving for apples competition, which was, I like that. And I didn't know the expression. You learn something new every day.
Bobbing for apples. It's been a while since I've been in the U.S. Bobbing for apples is the official term.
I think that it's very clear that there is no longer an appetite or a need to conceal itself under the veil of democratic rule. And one of the first things that Putin did as he sort of came out to declare victory and thank his choir for applauding the sermon was essentially to criticize Western, not just American, but Western democracies, which really sort of forces the question, or doesn't force it, but at least invites us to pose the question, whether we're going to hear over the next couple of months or perhaps years that, as a matter of fact, Russia is reverting out of the democratic system, which to a large degree, just to remind you, was imposed by, perestroika glasnost changes onto Russia. Russia has essentially no tradition of democratic rule. Whether we're going to see this Putin as the history buff that he is, as Michael Kimmich was telling us last week, really trying to revert to a more traditionally Russian political arrangement, which is, essentially imperial monarchy.
I mean, for me, the only to kind of pick up on that note, for me, the only real notable thing here is by how much he won, right? Even for someone running virtually unopposed, he won 87% of the vote at latest count, which is far more than he won in his last so-called elections, where even then his victory was assured. But 87% over, I'm looking here, if these numbers are correct, 76% the term before, 63% the term before that, 71% 2 terms before that, 53% he won in his first election in 2000. So 87% That's actually quite low for a one-party quasi-dictator. Usually people like him come away with 98, 99% of the vote. But for him, in his history, that's actually the highest it's ever been. And I just wonder, I don't really know what to make of that, if anything.
An avowal to the honesty and the transparency of the process. You see, we had a full 13% that voted against the government. I am sure that, the impression that I get, of course, is that, that was the 13% that was choreographed by the FSB to make sure that there would be some votes that could make it look like, in fact, there was a democratic process going on. I think, the point of 87% is that, of course, it does not fit any single voting pattern in any established democracy. But obviously, Russia is not a democracy. So I think that my basic question is, how long will Russia, or will Putin, for that matter, continue to try to present itself as a democracy? And I think that a paradigm shift of that kind would be massive. This would not be just, probably Putin presented himself as a dictator. This would not just be an al-Assad or a Saddam Hussein or something like Bukele in El Salvador. This would be something that would have, I think, a knock-off effect on a lot of the countries that had been in this political tradition that might actually see a viable political model emerging from this kind of autocratic project with imperial designs.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the case that Western democracies make, that we cannot let Russia win because we cannot show that this is a viable model of politics, because other countries will mimic this. I think there's a similar line of thinking when it comes to China. Both countries use the same rhetoric of democracy and freedom and pluralism to apply to their systems of government and political organizations as Western democracies do, liberal democracies do. It's interesting how, if you read, of course, I'm reading the translations in English and Chinese. I'm reading the English translation, Russian and Chinese, the translations, but they use the exact same rhetoric, the exact same words about democracy and pluralism and inclusivity that you often hear from Western leaders. And it's an interesting kind of, they're trying to, both China and Russia are trying to sort of redefine and reappropriate these very Western liberal ideas for their own causes.
What I see, I think, with some sort of clarity is the fact that we have had, lip service and mouthwash, democracy-flavored mouthwash, both in China and in Russia and in a host of other countries, obviously. But then what we also have had, and I think that this to me is sort of the most interesting part of it, is that the one mechanism from the Western, say, political arrangement that has actually been fairly loyally sustained has been a form of almost cannibalistic capitalism. Has actually helped both Russia and China to build the economic muscle on which then they have managed to reestablish or to sustain, their political systems in their own way. China has never really sort of paraded itself as a liberal democracy. It's still a communist country, but I think it is also true that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has actually offered a postcard of, Beijing, or a postcard of essentially the shopping mall. It's like, okay, well, you might have only one choice in politics, but look how many flavors of candy and how many types of bagels you can get. And I think that this has sort of contributed to get a lot of the tacit and very often explicit approval of Western countries, that while they saw democratic values, not just institutions, but democratic values eroded and sliding back, they were saying, well, yeah, that's terrible, but it's probably just a passing fever. But look how many flavors of bagels you can get in Beijing or in Moscow. So, I don't know if it's a cautionary tale, really, but it does point out to a certain amount of meekness on the side of Western powers, but at the same time, sort of a political agenda on the side of Russia. I do, as I said, I'll repeat it, I do think that we might be slowly looking at Russia shifting its account of what its political model is.
And then, of course, there's the question of what comes after Putin. Like, what will the political system look like? Who could even fill those shoes? In what way? When he eventually steps down from power, gets forced out of power, dies in any number of ways. He is 71 years old. His term now will go till 2030 in 6 years. So he'll be still younger than Joe Biden is today, we should point out. But that's not young. His health could decline. We know a million things can happen. And I think the question is, I think the better question is, like, we are stuck with Putin, right? This is the world we are in. It does not help to sort of live in a world we wish to be. It's important to recognize the world as it is and react accordingly. Putin is there. I think the question now for a lot of policymakers in the West is, what does a post-Putin Russia look like? Is there ever going to be the ability to have normalized relations with Russia, both because of Putin and specifically the war in Ukraine? Western countries deal with all kinds of non-democracies and dictatorships in awful countries. Can Russia one day, even if Russia walks away from democracy fully, can it one day have a relationship in some way with the larger world, with the West, with the United States, with Europe, even if it isn't a democracy, even if, regardless of what happens with Putin or after Putin? That to me is something that's a very important question, and one that I'm of course not alone in being very interested in how that plays out.
I think that you can look at the history of monarchic rule to get a sense of how these transitions of powers, I mean, even childless monarchs end up finding somebody to go ahead and completely screw up their project. But more, in more contemporary context, I mean, I'm thinking of things like Venezuela, where you had like really a charismatic leader who was sort of almost a revolutionary figure. Of course, he had any revolutionary credentials, Hugo Chavez, and as he sort of passed away, you had this sort of minor figure, absolutely not charismatic, not politically competent, Maduro, take over the position. And, I mean, he's still there. He has gone nowhere. The U.S. has said this, has said that, has moved in this direction. Trump had at some point even like threatened Venezuela with an invasion. Nothing happened.
Right. And now Maduro is a friend again because we need the oil. So the sanctions have been lowered and the penalties have been lowered, and that whole fight for freedom and democracy thing has kind of been pushed to the wayside because Russia fully invaded Ukraine. So suddenly Venezuela is the lesser of two evils.
I think that that's actually a very good answer to your very own question, which is that, well, if it walks away from democracy, they will still have oil, right? They will still have borscht. They will still have blinis.
Right. Which are all of tasty things.
Exactly.
They like. And, as Russia will still have oil as it walks away from democracy, just as the EU walks away from the Green Deal. So the oil will remain an important commodity going into
the oil will remain an important commodity. I think that their proximity to the Caucasus and the possibility of the Caucasus sort of suddenly like having, outbreaks of Islamism would still mean that Russia plays an important role in holding a certain like geostrategic gate. Nobody really knows what would be the alignment of, let's say, the Middle East and so on. But it's not just sort of an enemy, right? I mean, Russia, in whatever economic and political model, will remain a geostrategic asset potentially that the US at one point or another, or European countries, will need to count on. I mean, you never know what kind of threat could emerge that would put Russia and the European Union on the same side of the line. I mean, it's crazy to think, but that's the point about Venezuela and the US, right? Venezuela can solve problems for which Russia is for the European Union and the US. We never knew that was going to be the case, right? But there you are.
Right. Bedfellows can rearrange To mix my metaphors, bedfellows on the deck of the Titanic can rearrange faster than we realize. And to your point about the future, to have one bit of hopeful, to maybe end on a hopeful note, Vladimir Putin's current term goes until 2030. I was just flipping through the current edition of Foreign Affairs, and in the back, they always have this sort of a quick summary of recent books that are out. And they have one book that they've summarized and reviewed that looks at sort of the history of Western liberalism in cycles in a large historical time scale. And if past is prologue, as they say, according to the author of this book, this sort of malaise of what the author calls the winter of American-led liberal democracy will finish this pessimistic cycle, this down cycle by around 2030, and then we'll see an upswing of sort of the liberal project, which coincides nicely with Vladimir Putin's end of his current term. So maybe that's a point, something, a hook to hang our hat on looking forward, because right now things seem very grim on a number of fronts.
I'm thinking of saying something, but I think that anything I say other than what I'm actually saying right now, which is not yet saying anything, would actually just put a terrible, terrible damper on this. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Let's just leave it let's leave it on that hopeful note,
This is good. This is good. This is happy. This is fine. We just stop there and we reconvene in like about 10 seconds to talk about the stories coming up next week.
Sounds great.
So William Noah Glucroft.
Yes, Martin Gack, Dr. Martin Gack.
What is expecting us in these coming days?
Well, one story that jumped out at me, because I'm quite a lover of chocolate, of very good, very dark, bitter chocolate. That's my idea of sweets. Is a cocoa crisis that is unfolding in major cocoa production areas of the world, namely Africa. Ivory Coast and Ghana are some of the most important places for cocoa processing for the world. They then export their unrefined products to then chocolate makers, major chocolate companies that we know of in the United States and Europe, for then further production of chocolate products. And they've run out of beans because they can't afford the beans anymore. So cocoa processing has been slashed, and there's huge fears that there's going to be there will be massive price spikes in chocolate, which is a commodity. It's a luxury, of course. I think we can live without chocolate. But it's a major industry. And of course, Europe is known for chocolate. Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, to name just a few. Even Germany is known for a chocolate product. Well, I don't know if we can call Rittersport chocolate. That's maybe a more controversial topic. But yeah, so we'll see. It'll be tragically unfortunate to see what the knock-on effects of chocolate prices in Europe. But of course, this also has major economic impacts in the places that this is happening in Western Africa, where they're already, of course, massively at risk to inflation and other political and socioeconomic turmoil.
Yeah, you say we can live without chocolate. I would say just talk for yourself. I do not eat dark chocolate. I try to avoid it as much as I can. I'm a milk chocolate kind of guy. Yes, I'm weak.
I can't believe you're admitting that right now. You've heard it
in public. Anything from Toblerone to Suchard, I will actually eat. I am a milk.
I'm surprised that you have such a sweet tooth.
Well, I mean, I'm still a child. I eat chocolate like a child.
So you're like the Kinder Egg kind of guy. You like the treats inside the Kinder Egg.
I really can't stand Kinder. It's way too fatty in my mouth. But I would say that, milk chocolate, Rittersport included, that's great stuff. I would say on a more serious note that I think that there are a bunch of items that we consume daily across the world. I would say certainly across Europe, and after my 20-something years in the US, I would say that in the US, which one could clinically claim are luxuries, but I don't think that they would look at all like luxuries to the people actually consuming them. They look like, if not basic necessities, they most certainly look like basic goods. Chocolate being one of them, coffee being one of them. And it seems to me that as we are seeing more and more instability, including not only price spikes because of, climate change, but also sudden areas of conflict in commercial routes like the Red Sea, and so on and so forth, we're beginning to see all sorts of prices spike. And I think that this is having a direct effect on the political sensibilities of populations that are affected by those price changes. I mean, one of the stories that I've been following for the last at least 2-3 years is the major spike in prices of kebabs around Europe. And this is actually an item which you would say would not really make it into any serious economic index. But the fact is that this is sort of, a staple fare of youths who have high loads of necessity, but very low loads of assets. So it's a staple food for youths around Europe. And these things that used to really be very, very cheap had become now sort of restaurant pricing items. So we have gone from €3, €2.50 by 2019, 2020, to now paying essentially €8 or €9. So it's essentially threefold the price in 3 years. I mean, if this were an inflationary measure across foodstuff, we would be talking essentially about a major economic crisis. And it's not hitting all parts of the population the same way. But I think that what we're seeing consistently is that these various forms of crisis are actually ultimately having an effect on the way that people perceive their own life, well-being, and prosperity to be sort of eroded and not protected by government. So I think that the economic impact is very strong because there is a sense that the individual lives of people, that the consumers, as Americans like to say, is being affected. I would say in Europe, the word consumer is not synonymous with citizen. They're very different machines. In the US, you can actually pass the word consumer for citizen. But I think in this case, it's actually quite good to sort of conflate them, so to say, because there is a sense in which the consumer's incapacity to access things that used to be like daily goods. I mean, even if, sort of little treats like chocolate is no longer there. And these things are actually progressively disappearing. So on a more serious and perhaps much more somber note, the biggest story I think we're going to see unfold in the next few days, save any major unforeseen episode were to take place, is the question of the Israeli potential invasion of the city of Rafah in the south of the Gaza Strip. And this is really very, very important because the Israelis with their tanks are pretty much waiting at the gates, metaphorically. They have continued to, conduct bombing and conduct all sorts of targeted attacks, including last night the attack on the Shifa hospital again, in which people were killed, and like a family home where other 25 or 30 people were killed. More shootings of aid seekers standing in front of trucks carrying flour. There were like really very unpleasant pictures today of, people with bags of flour stained with blood, which eyewitnesses claim were the direct effect of attacks on aid seekers. And I think that the cumulative effect of all of these sort of postcards of hell have forced, as we were saying earlier in the show, Western countries, including some of the staunchest allies of Israel, to actually try to put a stop specifically to an incursion into Rafah. Because you have 1.4 million people sheltering there that the Israelis sent in that direction over the last 5 months, trying to basically say we're advancing on other parts of the Strip. The reason why this is a big deal is because Germany, the US, France, the European Union have given, von der Leyen included in the last couple of days, have given very clear indications that they do not want to see an Israeli incursion of Rafah. And Netanyahu has responded in no uncertain terms that he will send his troops into Rafah. I would think that if Netanyahu were indeed to give the order of going into Rafah, Europeans and Americans, Canadians included, would need to actually respond. They would not be free to simply fold. The Americans might try to find excuses or something of the kind, but they would not be free to simply fold and let Netanyahu have his way with the civilian population of Rafah. So I think that this is something that I'm particularly looking at very attentively, and I'm quite frightened, to be honest, because I've been following this very closely, and it's been very off-putting, very depressing, and very upsetting seeing the carnage. But also because I think that the stakes for international order and geostrategic alliances is very, very, very high, are very high.
That's it for this week's Euroscopic, written by us, produced by us, and edited by Martin. You can catch us every week either at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com, or on euobserver.com. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts. Thanks very much for listening to this episode. Till next time, I'm William Glucroft.
And I am Martin Gack.
Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.